Hello everybody, it's Pojo. We are finally doing it. We're going to be talking a little bit about legendary crafting, specifically what legendaries are best to craft starting out, and what legendaries are best to destroy, or at least safe to destroy. I've always been a little bit reticent to do these types of videos just because in general I do think that my advice as far as destroying legendaries is don't. I really think that most legendaries have some potential to either have a decent amount of fun with, or at least maybe even build a good deck out of, and there are a decent amount of things that the community hasn't explored or hasn't really set up yet that often gets missed. As some examples of things that I've definitely seen ranked very, very low and have been told by many people to dust, Shimmer Pack, Moment of Creation, Curiox, which became a pretty serious control deck in the late part of set 3. I have seen people advise Mask of Torment be destroyed, or Aid of the Huru, and all of those made tier 1 decks or tier 2 decks that were relatively competitive and a lot of fun and still hang around the meta today. You definitely can see all of those in a standard set 4 game. So I do think that we tend to jump the gun a little bit on legendaries that seem bad because they might be bad in a particular meta or they might be bad in a particular set, but oftentimes those cards will be useful to you later and it's easier to just keep them than to craft more of them. However, if you absolutely need dust, I can certainly understand why you might want a more serious list. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on a top 5 setup where we essentially discuss 5 of the easiest legendaries to destroy that are almost certainly not going to be useful, and 5 of the most necessary legendaries to craft that'll be in a vast majority of decks of that particular color or faction pairing. Because I think that there are certainly some cards that are definitely good to have in most decks, or at least most decks of your color pairing, and I also think that there are some cards that, even though we have tried very hard, cannot really be brewed with in a way that is fun and may actually cause you some misery. So let's talk a little bit about, from sets 1 through 4, what are the best 5, what are the worst. Alright, so best 5. We're going to start with number 1 and move down because, well, number 1's probably not going to be a surprise. It's Sandstorm Titan. And yeah, as one of the, I think the only monocolored card on this list, this is just a pretty necessary craft that also happens to be in colors that you use a lot. Time actually has a ton of useful monocolored legendaries that can be crafted for a variety of different decks. If you want to go low, Teacher of Humility is now just a base 4 of, and it is really, really strong. If you want to go high, cards like Worldbearer, Behemoth, and Mystic Ascendant do an amazing job. There's some good Combre cards like Vodakhan and Seraph. There's a lot of things in Time that you can play around with, but really, the only thing that you generally need to sort of fill the spaces between the low end and the high end is Sandstorm Titan. This card, as far as what it offers for stats and cost, is still just the tops. It is an extremely powerful 4-drop. It is hard to kill. It is generally really, really good in the early stages of the game. If you're a bronze player or someone who is just starting out, Sandstorm Titan tends to be something that people don't run enough answers to. They don't run Vanquish or Polymorph or Annihilate, and they just don't have enough ways to get around Sandstorm Titan, which means they can really take over a game in a very serious way. This card has seen competitive play for 2 to 3 solid years, and it's a time card, which all of the other cards in this setup are going to be dual colored at least. I do think that this one is just as far as time goes, this is probably one of your first crafts, and it still remains your first craft in pretty much any situation. Yeah, Sandstorm Titan's super solid. There's not really anything to say about it apart from the fact that it is just very powerful and it is very hard to deal with. Certainly this card is not the be-all end-all of every time deck, and I often build decks without it now, but it takes some work to figure out exactly what you need to do to build a time deck without Sandstorm Titan. And I would say that this card is just super valuable early craft, one of the first things that you should be getting. On that same vein, let's actually talk about Heart of the Vault, which is my number 2. I actually have quite a few different interesting. These ones are all going to be pretty close, but basically everything in the dual faction that sort of just makes up the most important stuff. I choose Heart of the Vault as number 2 just because it's one of the most fun factions, and also it's a card that I like even in Praxis tokens. I've never seen anyone playing without. This card may have a very, very steep influence cost, but the 3-for-1 advantage that it offers is just critical in so many different Praxis decks. I really think that this card is just insanely strong, and it tends to be just really, really powerful in terms of all of the different advantage that it gives you. You find that you are frequently warping it because it is almost always the best thing to do. It's just active on board. The extra card draw from it is great. The cost reduction is really beneficial. It does something to your opponent's things. Like it can frequently 3-for-1, frequently 2-for-1. Because it is a warp card, it often doesn't cost you card advantage in addition to drawing you a card. And it is just a solid body in Praxis, which Praxis always needs solid bodies. It's very, very happy to have a big mid-range unit, even if it's like a big token deck. So yeah, this card is still seeing play in set 3, and like ever since it was out in set 2, it has just been a staple of Praxis and a staple of the meta. I don't think there are that many decks that don't run Heart of the Vault, and this is just like a great way to pop Aegises, do a bunch of other amazing things. Next up is Black Sky Harbinger. So Black Sky Harbinger has been around for a pretty long time. It's actually been buffed, but even before it was buffed, it was a pretty staple card in Feln decks. Champion of Cunning is by far the most important card that you can run in Feln, but Black Sky Harbinger is a close second. And as far as this card goes, like it is just the stabilizer, and it does most of all of the things that you really, really want to do. Lately, I have been using End of the Line in place of Black Sky Harbinger in certain decks, but since you need one or the other, I definitely think that this card is really reasonable craft if you're going to be running Feln out, and I think that it is just like extremely strong just for all of the different things that it does. It pops Aegises, it allows you to gain a lot of life and stabilize on board. It is fairly cheap and inexpensive. Like 6 is not that expensive for a card that does all of the things that it does, so it's very stat efficient, which is always something that we're looking at in terms of overall value. And yeah, it's just very, very hard to see Feln decks without it. There are some other cards that sort of fill this slot. Rindra the Duskblade is often more popular in lower tier, or not lower tier, but lower end Feln decks. But really this card is just the bread and butter in such a really strong way that I think it's almost always worth grabbing, and it's a lot of fun to play. It's very effective. It does most of the things that you absolutely want it to do. Okay, pretty much all of these, yeah, it's a set 1 card, and set 1 still has a lot of strong cards, including Icaria, the Liberator. Yeah, it'd be pretty hard not to put Icaria on this list. She's fairly low down just because Rakano doesn't need Icaria anymore to finish out its curve. We now have a new replacement that's starting to come in. The 6-cost Rezon is really, really solid in this same spot. And as far as things go, like Icaria is just a really, really beneficial finisher. She's not always been the absolute tip-top card in the meta, but very frequently Icaria Blue, Armory, anything with Rise to the Challenge has always ended up playing this card, and you'll see an awful lot of her in the meta. She's plenty of fun to play, like she gets you big, fancy Timmy units. She is very, very good in terms of stat efficiency, in terms of all of the different things that she does for your deck. She gives you immediate damage. She tends to trade or block really well. She also gives you something too big for your opponents to handle, typically in the form of a weapon. Basically, this card has made up Armory lists since at least set 2, and even as far as set 1, fairly late into set 1. Armory decks were able to run without her for a pretty long time, but nerfs to cards like Smuggler's Stash and other setups have made it so that Icaria is just the standard top end for any Rakano deck, and really, really reasonable, often just like pretty much always a tier 1 staple. It's very rare that you don't see this card, and also this card is just a staple of the set 1 set, one of the fanciest and funnest cards to play, so I see no reason not to craft her and play around with her if you haven't done so already. She'll definitely be a top end in any sort of big Rakano deck that you want to build. Alright, the final one is sort of a toss-up actually. It's Bandit Queen. Although Vicious Highwayman is now filling the same slot surprisingly well, despite them being fairly different cards in terms of design. Bandit Queen is the 3/2 charge that when you summon it, your units get +1 strength and quick draw. Like overall, this card has just always been in exactly the right spot for Stonescar to make decks happen. Like you get to be aggressive with her. She does a ridiculous amount of nonsense at a very, very short period of time. Like, anytime that you play her with Grenadins or Champion of Chaos or any sort of aggressive gunslingers, you tend to feel pretty good about her, and she is just really, really good at pushing damage across and getting surprise damage in places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get it. Because very frequently, like even in a situation where your board is empty, you can sometimes get 4 surprise damage out of her. She does the thing that fire decks most want to do, which is push damage in a way that is very, very hard for your opponent to answer. Like, I think this card has just always been super, super strong, and like as far as all of the different archetypes, Stonescar has prevailed over and over and over again. It's actually a little bit out of meta right now, which is why Bandit Queen is currently at the bottom of this list. But I do think that this is one of the more important crafts, and that the set 1 cards are still some of the strongest cards to have at the moment. At some point, these cards will rotate out, which is why you should keep an eye as well on Vicious Highwayman, the 4/2 charge Warcry that deals 1 damage and gets a bunch of benefits if an enemy unit dies. This card really does some of the same things that Bandit Queen is doing, but I do think that you need one or the other to make Stonescar aggro work, and Stonescar is still very much an aggro format. So this is one of the most common meta cards, or Bandit Queen and Vicious Highwayman together are some of the most common meta cards that tend to be out there for pretty much anything. So honorable mentions go to Vadius, Kothan, and Ayan, all of which are really, really staple cards for their faction pairings, neither of which we've covered in this particular setup. Skycrag is currently in meta, but I don't think it needs Vadius to really run, and Huru very rarely needs Kothan, even though Kothan is pretty much always an excellent card in that setup. But yeah, like if you want to pick up cards like that, they are certainly very strong. Time obviously has a lot of cool cards as well. Mystic Ascendant, Worldbearer, Behemoth, those are all really, really good things. I just don't think that any of them are strictly necessary. And also, Teacher of Humility, very, very powerful set 3 card right now. Certainly not necessary to build most decks, but very, very powerful in a wide variety of tier 1 decks at the moment. So certainly was an honorable mention as far as things go. So yeah, that is all of the major top 5 crafts. Before we go into the bottom 5, I did have some one-ofs to mention. Some cards that are worth it to have at least one of just for the heck of it. Sword of the Sky King is an 8-cost 8/8. This card is just like a standard control finisher, tends to play very well in green-blue or green-yellow decks. You almost always want to have one of these just because it is very, very good at getting a ton of value in a control type deck. And if you're playing green control, this card really, really functions well as a one-of. In the same vein as Icaria, Starsteel Daisho is just a really, really good card to get off Rise to the Challenge, which if you're playing Icaria, you generally feel really happy to have at least one of these in the deck, just because it tends to give you a really good finisher for those types of control decks. I wouldn't rate it as much more than a one-of in any type of deck, but these are specifically the cards that you basically never need more than one of. Temporal Distortion is another big control finisher, tends to be really, really powerful and works really, really well with a variety of different decks. If you want to play channels and chalices and all sorts of interesting options like that, Temporal Distortion can get you a lot of bang for your buck with cards like Harsh Rule and Channel the Tempest and that sort of TJP list. But you never not want more than one of them, so it definitely doesn't come in. And who would I be? What kind of person would I be if I didn't mention you tomorrow? This card is probably the most undervalued, I think, of the entire batch, and I think that after Crests came out, it's very, very hard not to say that this card is good as a control finisher. This card just gets you a ton of power, which allows you to play all of your ridiculously useful cards, and also allows you to sort through your deck using Crests to get something in the tops. I wouldn't say that this is a tier 1 card or anything, but I have always enjoyed and I have found a tremendous amount of use out of this card, so I'll add it to the list of honorable mentions of one-ofs, just because it is really, really beneficial, and, well, it's just kind of a signature trademark for me. Okay, so those are all just cards that you're happy to have one of. Now let's talk about the bottom 5. What cards are absolutely worth disenchanting overall. Like, I really have a hard time with this because I do think that, like, even cards like Regent's Blade, which is number 5 on my list, might eventually find some sort of deck. This is Island Sword, so it's mostly a flavor piece, as are a wide variety of cards in this list. But yeah, the wielder is invulnerable to damage for 6 and 3 green influence. There's a lot of things that I find a little bit depressing about this card, the main one being that influence cost, because it is very expensive for what it is doing, but the influence cost means that it's pretty impossible to put it on anything other than a green unit. And there aren't that many green units that really benefit from having Regent's Blade at the moment. Not only is the card really stat inefficient, but overall being invulnerable to damage, while a useful thing, still suffers very badly against hard removal, which there is plenty of and in pretty much every faction. Invulnerability to damage is a hate effect. It really only matters in terms of dealing with Praxis and other fire-based colors, because those are the colors that do damage to kill your stuff. If you're invulnerable to damage otherwise, then they'll have Silence, they'll have Vanquish, they'll have Annihilate, they'll have tons of hard removal that can actually kill whatever's got Regent's Blade on it. And since this card costs 6 to put onto a unit, that's really, really tough to set up. I just think this card is so stat inefficient and also so very linear that it doesn't really play even in the brews where you really want it to play. If you can find a unit that's good to put Regent's Blade on, it's just so expensive and so little benefit that I don't really think that this card actually has any play to it. It is a cool sword though, so it definitely makes the bottom of my list just because it is, you know, like it seems fairly fun, and I feel like there could maybe be some sort of benefit to it eventually. Maybe even it could get buffed or set up a little bit better. But yeah, at the moment this card is not super playable. Okay, so moving into the next two, we're going to talk about cards that we have brewed with pretty extensively and never had any success with. Maybe there is a deck that you can brew with it, but the main reason that I think that these are good disenchants is because these cards tend to lead you down a path very, very clearly, and then that path just isn't good, or it doesn't really, like, it's not fun. And if that's the case, then we definitely don't really want to play around with them. Like certain cards like Means to an End or Azurite Prixis or other things like that, you can build really weird, fun decks with those. They aren't going to be good decks, but you can build something and actually have an enjoyable time with them. Darkclaw Ravager, I have just found doesn't really work the way that you want it to. It frequently gets removed because it's fairly stat inefficient. The ability to give additional attack to dinosaurs, like the amount it's giving to them is really not that great. So you're asking for basically another thing off of Darkclaw Ravager to make it fun, which is that you have to somehow increase the attack of Darkclaw Ravager. There are cards that do that. In fact, there are even Nightfall dinosaurs that do that, but once that happens, like, it's still pretty tough as to whether or not you're going to get any sort of benefit to dinosaurs that helps you out. If it gave health and attack, or if it gave some other benefits than just 2 strength at a time, then maybe this card would actually be beneficial. But most of the time I found that if you're playing a big heavy dino decks and you even are playing Nightfall dinos, the first card to go is Darkclaw Ravager, and I've just found that every time that I've tried to build around it, it has very frequently just become kind of a weight around the neck of the dino deck. So this card needs some sort of stat buff to be extremely beneficial. It just never quite works, and overall I'm really frustrated with the design of it for that reason. But I do think that, like, yeah, this is probably a worthy disenchant if you've got a couple copies. Sentinel's Might is even lower down, just because this is a card that very clearly doesn't work. 6 cost triple time, and once again we've got that 6 and triple influence, meaning that you have to be very, very deep in this to get the benefit. But in this case, the benefit is just kind of underwhelming. The Life Force ability gives you a ton of strength and health. It is permanent strength and health, so you get to very much buff up your board, but you also have to A, gain the life, and B, spend the power, which means that you often won't be able to play this until like turn 8 or so if you're doing something like Water of Life or some other effect that gives you a lot of life. And then the benefit is that you improve your position on board, which very frequently, if you're running Life Force units, like you're typically running things like Oasis Seeker or anything with lifesteal, you often have to attack and trade to get Sentinel's Might to do anything. I would say that this card does have the potential to completely blow out a board, but most of the time just making everything bigger isn't really all that satisfying an effect, and it is definitely just a bad card. So since it's neither particularly fun nor particularly competitive, I generally rank this card very, very lowly, and I think it's fine to disenchant it because there's just, like, even if you build a deck that does the perfect Sentinel's Might thing, what are you doing with that deck? Like, probably you're trying to do even cooler things, like play Hall of Lost Kings or that 10-cost legendary. There's just way too many cool things to do with Life Force, and Sentinel's Might just isn't satisfying to play. Alright, next one is going to be pretty easy to pick up. It's Rock Carapace. Rock Carapace is a 7-cost 9/9 that says the wielder can't fly. At the end of your turn, if the wielder attacked, stun it. This is a draft bomb, and certainly it's fine in draft if you can pick it up, because it is a fairly efficient way to give a bunch of stats to a unit. But as far as regular decks go, oh man, I just don't see it. Not only does it tend to disable your unit every time that it attacks into a random chump blocker, but it is also just so expensive and like so little effect. Like, it's got 2 drawbacks, which means that, like, not only are you typically only trading Rock Carapace for some sort of blocker, and then your opponent just removes it, but also, like, you tend to just invest too much in this, and it often robs you of a potential path to lethal because it gets rid of the ability to fly or the ability to do anything cool. Like, there are some ways with maybe unblockable units that this card could be somewhat useful, but I think there are just too many better ways to deal more damage or to wreak more value out of a particular setup. So yeah, Rock Carapace just doesn't play well in ranked. I think that you should definitely pick it in draft if you see it, but in ranked it's just not there. It's only there as a draft legendary. All right, and the final card, I think I've mentioned how little I like this card before, but it is Riddle Game. Riddle Game says draw a card for each card that you have drawn this turn. And this is sort of a puzzle. Like, you have some ability to sort of fiddle around with this and be like, okay, if I want to draw a bunch of cards, I need to make Riddle Game cheaper so that I can draw the cards and do that. Or I need to figure out some way to draw cards passively so that I can Riddle Game after that. Like, as far as that goes, that's fine, but there are a couple of problems with Riddle Game that really sort of hamper its design and hamper its ability to be in any way good. The main thing is that since you are already drawing cards to activate Riddle Game, the odds are pretty good that you have enough card draw to play out whatever it is that you need to do. So playing Riddle Game often doesn't put you in any further situation of advantage, especially since in order to draw enough cards for Riddle Game to be beneficial, you have to draw something like 3 or 4. That means that when you cast Riddle Game, you'll draw 3 to 4 cards, which 4 cards for 6 is okay. 3 cards for 6 is middling. But if you draw 4 cards with Riddle Game, then probably you already drew 4 cards, and probably you didn't get to play any of those cards because you just spent 6 on Riddle Game, and now you have probably more cards than you can actually hold in hand, which means you have to effectively discard cards, and you don't get the effective card advantage out of Riddle Game that you really wanted to get. Like, there are lots of ways to activate Riddle Game in a really spectacular fashion, but once you do that, like, the benefit doesn't improve your situation on board. It doesn't improve your situation in terms of health advantage. It doesn't improve your situation anywhere except for in terms of your hand. And odds are the best way to improve your situation in your hand is to have cheaper draw spells or better draw spells. I've just found this card to be super underwhelming every time that we've even tried to play it, and like, it just doesn't do anything that you want it to do as far as things go. Drawing more cards after drawing cards is a funny idea, and that much I can say for Riddle Game. But even if this card cost like 5 or 4, it'd be fairly hard to justify as a legitimate card to be playing. So I really can't recommend this card, and I think it's probably the worst card in terms of just absolute stone doing nothing useful when it is played. So yeah, that's my list as far as things go in terms of what you shouldn't craft in those situations. There are lots and lots of honorable mentions here as well. Like, we can certainly talk a little bit about cards like Azurite Prixis, which doesn't do really anything, and if there is a deck that plays around it, we've actually played a couple of decks around it and found them to be pretty fun. Like most of these decks actually aren't quite good enough, but you know, these are always potential sleepers. Like I have definitely seen some play out of the old worst card in the set, Film Cauldron, which wasn't doing a lot of work. Team Bro's been building a little bit with this. I've been building a little bit with this. Now that Tribute is a thing, having a 0-cost Tribute enabler is really good. This card enables Life Force in some pretty cool ways. Like, you know, there are just like some cards like this where it's like, this probably never is going to be competitive, but it at least is starting to find some fun sort of niches, and I think that those are cards that are certainly worth keeping around just because they're a lot of fun to have. Yeah, so that's my list as far as like best and worst legendaries, and also a couple of one-of crafts. I hope you guys enjoyed. We will be back with more brews very soon and more basics as well. I'm really, really excited to get to it. But yeah, just a little bit of an aside for you talking about legendaries, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. See you guys next time. Feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to like see videos, and you can also follow my Twitch. We might be working on a Patreon pretty soon. Lots of possible things that could be happening that could be lots of fun. Anyways, I am out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a very good night. Cheers.